Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Mental Cartographer. I'm your host Dane, and today we're going to be talking about something you may not have thought of before. Where does meaning come from? You may ask, what is that question? Books are books, meaning is meaning, I have a cup is a cup. But is meaning something that really only exists in our minds, shaped by our psychological states and internal representations? Or is it something external, grounded in the real world, grounded in objective reality, independent of what we actually think? This is a classic debate, often framed as internalism versus externalism, and we're just going to be looking at this, examining thought experiments like Putnam's famous twin Earth experiment, and explore how meaning operates in our everyday language. If we just look at dictionary definitions, meaning is the thing one intends to convey, especially by language. As you may have guessed, internalism is the view that holds that meaning comes from our internal psychological states. Meaning is in the head. It is contained by our own self-concepts and mental representations of the world around us. Externalism, on the other hand, argues that meaning comes from the real world, from the relationship between words and things outside of our minds. I've always loved thinking that each individual has their own thoughts and has their own mental representations of the world. Everything is a subjective experience. We don't ever get to experience objective reality, as everything that we know and everything that we have is filtered through our own perception. So, the idea of internalism basically argues that meaning is tied to internal cognitive structures. In other words, meaning is something we construct in our brain, rather than something that exists out there in the world. An example of this would probably be like, if you think of the phrase, the sun sets. Scientifically speaking, we know that the sun doesn't actually set. We know that the earth rotates and creates the illusion of the sun going down. But does that mean people who say the sun sets actually believe that the sun is physically moving downwards? No. And Noam Chomsky uses this to argue that language doesn't always directly refer to the external world. It's about the mental representation and what is salient to the individual. However, if we simply take the view that everything is in our head, how do we explain communication? How do I tell you about a book and you understand that I'm telling you about a book? How do I tell you about a cup and you understand that I'm telling you about a cup? Wouldn't that mean that every single individual has their own separate personal meaning that has its own nuances, which suggests what I think is a cup is not what you think is a cup? This is where the theory of externalism comes in. This is where the ever so famous twin Earth experiment comes into play. So imagine this. There are two planets, Earth and twin Earth. On twin Earth, it's basically exactly the same as Earth. On both planets, there are people who speak the same language and use the word water to describe the clear, drinkable liquid found in rivers and lakes. But here's the difference. On Earth, our Earth, water is H2O. On twin Earth, water is made of a completely different chemical structure. Let's say XYZ, but it looks and behaves exactly like water. Even though the people on both planets use the water in the same way and have the same psychological state when saying it, the real-world reference of water are different. This means that meaning isn't just what's about in our heads. It depends on the external world. Similarly, it was also argued that perhaps water has always meant H2O, even before we discovered what H2O was. This is the argument that people from 2,000 years ago who didn't have any knowledge about chemical structure, if they were using water to describe something that wasn't H2O, they would simply be incorrect. Water is H2O, and that's that. So, if meaning isn't just about psychological states, what determines it? Putnam suggests that meaning depends on a division of linguistic labor. In any society, not everyone has to be an expert on every word. You don't need to know everything about a word to be able to use it. For example, let's say you don't know the difference between an elm tree and a beech tree. When you use the words elm or beech, you might not personally know what they refer to, but the meaning of these words is still fixed in your linguistic community, probably by some tree experts or tree fanatics, or I don't know who else likes trees, but whoever they are. This shows that meaning doesn't just rely on our internal representations. It's also shaped by the real-world environment and the knowledge of experts in our society. And with that, we'll be right back after a quick song to talk about words that perhaps aren't as simple as cup or book, words that may be more abstract. Welcome back to the second half of the Mental Cartographer. So far, we've been talking about our meanings in the head, internalism versus externalism. But with that entire debate, we've mostly been talking about words that refer to physical objects. So, as I mentioned, water, the elm tree and beech tree, cups, books, etc. But what about abstract concepts? Let's take the word happiness. Unlike cups or trees or books or anything else, we can't point to a single physical object and say that is happiness. Unless you're like in some philosophical mood or some sort of love-struck mood where you're like, this person is happiness. But no. Sure, we can give examples. Those are examples. You can say someone is happiness. You can say, if your fridge gives you happiness, you can say, my fridge is happiness. But none of these really capture what happiness is. Even closer representations, maybe someone laughing, a literal smile, a warm hug, all of these but none of these actually say, that is happiness. So, does this mean happiness is just in the head? I would argue that perhaps it is not just in the head. Well, yes, we have concepts, and the concept of happiness may be relative to each individual. However, we also have shared ideas of happiness. Consider how different cultures define happiness. In some places, happiness is about individual fulfillment, achieving personal goals, financial stability, etc. But in others, perhaps it's more of a community thing. It's more about achieving harmony with strong social bonds, belonging, and contributing to a larger whole. And while I'm not saying that both of these have to be mutually exclusive, I'm saying that perhaps there is more priority on some parts of happiness in different cultures. This suggests that the abstract concept of happiness is shaped by both internal psychological states, which is how we personally experience it, and external factors, such as cultural norms, social expectations, and perhaps even economic conditions. Unlike objects like cups, which are obviously grounded, in some sense, in external reality, abstract concepts like happiness seem to be more in a middle space, partly shaped by the mind and partly shaped by the world. Perhaps we could say the same things about actual objects. I mean, if you ask an American versus someone in Europe what they think a cup is, you're going to get very different answers. So, on some level, it does have to be internal. We must have our own concepts in which we base meanings on. However, on another sense, it does have to be external. We do take information from the real world to inform our own internal concepts. Since we've seen rather strong arguments on both internalism and externalism, we may think, as I literally just alluded to, what if meaning is actually a combination of both internalism and externalism? I would argue that perhaps meaning is an emergent property, something that arises from the interaction between the mind and the world. For example, when we learn a new word, we first internally process it, we connect it to our existing knowledge and concepts, and engrave it in our minds in our own subjective reality, and then we externally verify it. We check whether it aligns with real-world references and social usage. So, we're going to just bring it back to the idea of the pencil, which is also discussed in multiple different studies. If we suddenly discovered all pencils were actually living organisms, would we suddenly stop calling them pencils? Probably not. This suggests that while meaning has an external basis, our internal cognitive structures also shape how we use and interpret the words. So, final thoughts. Is it in our heads? Is it in the world? Is it both? Are we constrained by our own subjective reality? Are we constrained by the actual objective reality? This goes into tons of different debates, but no matter which theory you lean towards, it really just demonstrates how complex the idea of meaning is, and yet we still use meaning every day. Even right now, the only way that you're understanding what I'm saying is because we have some sort of shared meaning that you are able to understand from my words. So, next time you use a word like freedom or justice or happiness, ask yourself, where does its meaning truly come from? And that's it for today's episode of the Mental Cartographer. I'll see you next time with something that may or may not be more interesting than this, I'm not sure.